The OCR English Language Paper 2 is coming up in May. I've got some slightly modified advice to help you get full marks for question 4. Stay tuned, you're watching Schofield on Shakespeare.
Simili a degli eroi, abbiamo il cuore a strisce, portaci dove vuoi.
You all know the question 4 mark scheme and the fact that AO2 is not explicitly referenced. And yet, look at some of the indicative content points from previous Paper 2 question 4 mark schemes. The suggestion in June 2019 is that you might make reference to Silito's use of lively, enthusiastic alliteration and the repetition of the first person pronoun in order to scoop up evaluative marks for AO4. Reminder that AO4 is your sustained critical evaluation of the statement. Similarly, in November 2022, look at the use of subject terminology in the indicative content. This examiner is suggesting that you might make reference to direct speech, extended and complex figurative language, a lexical cluster of words with romantic or magical associations, long, complex compound sentences, multiple verbs. So clearly evaluation is not just about pure ideas. In November 2023, the indicative content is once again packed full of AO2 looking technical terminology. For this particular question, the examiners are suggesting that you might make reference to extended and complex figurative language, harsh and blunt alliteration, the use of dialogue, the use of oral imagery. So, what does this mean? Do Schofield's top tips, trumpeted in previous videos, still stand? Well, yes, but I think number 4 could be tweaked slightly. It is true that there's no need to analyse the language. However, I would like to change this slightly to use subject terminology post-quotation in order to produce more technical, specific evaluation. And actually, while we're on the tweaking trail, I would also like to revise my guidance for number 6 so that it is even more helpful and specific. Include comparative evaluation at the end of each main paragraph. Weigh up the statement in relation to both texts at the end of each main paragraph. Which text more closely aligns to the statement and why? So, what might this look like? For June 2022, Paper 2, Question 4, the statement was, both texts powerfully present people terrified by the power of nature. The Paper 1 extract was from Du Maurier's The Birds. Read and pause if you would like to do so. Text 2 is from Susan Hill's I'm the King of the Castle. So here's the model paragraph using tweaked guidance. Text 1 opens by describing Nat being repeatedly attacked by a flock of birds. He is terrified. These birds kept coming at him from the air, silent save for the beating wings, the terrible fluttering wings. Nat is petrified by these repeated attacks, something powerfully represented by the repetition of wings within a dramatic short sentence. The effect is breathless, and we can get a sense that Nat cannot come to terms with such an unusual, terrifying event. Much smaller birds trying to take on a human being. In contrast, whereas text 1 opens with the attacks, text 2 starts with relative calm and indifference. Initially, Kingshaw is not terrified by the power of nature or birds. He took no notice. However, tension begins to build through this opening paragraph as a single crow rose and circled, flapping about his head. These verbs show the crow flying very close to Kingshaw in a way which he is likely to find disconcerting. However, at this stage, he is not terrified, unlike Nat, who is forced to run as fast as he can to try to get away. Let's dissect this. Well, note that the opening sentences specifically address the statements. This would usually be within a single sentence, but here it's two. Note that rather than say he is terrified by the power of nature, this is too generic, I list which specific part of nature is terrifying him, a flock of birds. Next up, it's that embedded quotation. Now look at the evaluation, which is, as ever, 2 sentences long. Within the evaluation, I incorporate some more technical terminology in the reference to the repetition of wings and a dramatic short sentence. This helps me evaluate the extent to which the texts are powerfully presenting people terrified by the power of nature. That single short sentence, the terrible fluttering wings, accentuates the claustrophobic fear being experienced by Nat, and thus it makes sense that I specifically reference this within my evaluation. It's now time to compare. Notice here that I use a subordinate clause beginning with whereas, which means that I'm comparing something specific. I then address the statement in relation to text 2. I use a quotation. I then extend my point about the statement and include a second quotation. This then needs to be evaluated, and note that once again I've used subject terminology by picking out the fact that these verbs show unsettling, strange movements from the crow, which if continued for a period of time could well result in him becoming terrified. Finally, note the additional comparison at the end of the paragraph. Here's what this structure then looks like. Start main paragraphs with a topic sentence about text 1, which provides a detailed initial response to the statements. Next up, the topic sentence is backed up by a short embedded quotation. Make sure that is in a separate sentence. Next up, evaluation. To what extent does or doesn't this detail powerfully present people terrified by the power of nature, or whatever your particular question is? Aim to include subject terminology so that you're evaluating more precisely the extent to which the text powerfully, in this instance, presents people terrified by the power of nature. Next up, the important comparison. Make sure that it is specific and there's a logical link between the comparisons you are making. You again need to make sure you've got a quotation, this time from text 2. And then again, it's the evaluation. To what extent does or doesn't it, in this particular question, powerfully present people terrified by the power of nature within text 2? Again, where appropriate, use subject terminology so you evaluate more precisely the extent to which the text powerfully presents people, in this example, terrified by the power of nature. At the end of the paragraph, you want comparative evaluation, referring to this statement: in which text is it more powerfully presented that people are terrified by the power of nature, and briefly explain why.
This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production with slightly modified advice for question 4. Best of luck for those exams fast approaching.